William Ellery Channing is one of the great Unitarian preachers of our history. If you're not familiar with him, I'll give you a little bit of a biography of who was listed to me as one of our Unitarian Universalist saints. He might have had a problem with that, but he was a classic preacher. A tall, classically handsome white man with slightly disheveled hair. I can't imagine why I might find him appealing. He was born in New England to a very well-off family. His granddaddy was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and then went on to be a prosecutor of slave ships and slave traders in Rhode Island. This is the kind of stock that he came from, this family setting that instilled in him morality and Christianity. He grew up in a very Calvinist tradition that's a little more conservative than we see today in most of our UU congregations. But he went to Harvard Divinity School when he was only 15, and he graduated in 1798. So this is the time period we're talking about. He was ordained into the Congregationalist movement of Massachusetts, called the Standing Order of Massachusetts. This is the Congregationalist tradition that we get our Christian heritage from as Unitarians and Universalists, but it's also where the United Church of Christ gets their origins, and they're still Congregationalist communities today. So we all share this common lineage that our churches stem from. But Channing was a little bit more of a humanist than a theist. Because of where he grew up and how he grew up, where he would go to church and he would hear the hardline dogma and the really repulsive language for him of the Calvinist tradition. They used words like the depravity of humanity and the worthlessness, the need for grace. He was put off by this and kind of rejected God and Christianity, even though he was a minister. Until he went down south in the late 18th, early 19th century America and saw the horrors of slavery firsthand. In Richmond, Virginia, he had what he calls a change of heart. He said, "I gave myself up to God." And I find that interesting because when you see the horrors of humanity and what we might do to one another, how does that lead one back to a higher power rather than giving up? But Channing said, "I found myself struck by the splendor of the whole world, the whole cosmos. To find the divine in the natural world, in the stars, in the sky, in the works of the earth, and on the flip side of humans' capacity for evil and their capacity for change and morality, that human agency was connected to his idea of the divine." He went back to Harvard and was elected to the faculty there. And in 1805, a big controversy broke out at Harvard. It's called the Unitarian controversy. Was Christianity going to take a traditional Orthodox Trinitarian route, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, or a Unitarian route that viewed God just as a Father? And the divinity of Jesus was up for debate. The liberals, the Unitarians, won that controversy, and Harvard became a Unitarian Christian powerhouse. But soon, the other standing order churches, those Congregationalist churches, the Trinitarian ones, stopped being as open to the Unitarian preachers. They stopped doing pulpit swaps with people like Channing. So the split gets wider and wider and wider, and it leads to this famous moment in our UU history in 1819 on May 5th at the ordination of Reverend Jared Sparks at the First Independent Church of Baltimore. That's now First Unitarian Church of Baltimore today. Channing was the invited speaker at this ordination. This is the tradition in our congregations. If you've never been to an ordination or installation service, you often invite someone to come and give the sermon, and it's a big honor. And folks usually use it to weigh forth on the big theological questions of the day. Channing was the biggest speaker, and he was invited to do so. And in his sermon that we heard from, he rails against the hardline Trinitarian Christian heresy that he sees, the deception, the refusal to be open to other religious denominations, to other religious views. He gives this incredible sermon that he later calls Unitarian Christianity. And he sets the basis for what we know as modern day Unitarianism, at least, Unitarian Universalism. A lot of it gets spelled out in that 3-hour-long sermon. We are not going to do it all today. Don't worry. But you heard some of the most important parts to me, at least earlier in our reading. So even those of us who are not Christian or not even theist can recognize some of our values in that sermon. And I have to imagine that in the absolute flames that he was throwing at Trinitarian Christianity, poor Reverend Jared Sparks, who was just there to try and get ordained, I don't know if that's what he signed up for in inviting William Ellery Channing that day, but here we are. A biographer wrote, Channing fervently believed that God had made human nature, with its capacity for moral choice and ever-increasing understanding, akin to the divine. He confidently preached the possibility of unending moral and spiritual progress for all who would shape their lives in accordance with its demands. We might call this today Christian humanism, or humanism influenced by Christianity. But I think a more accurate statement might be humanism influenced by the Unitarians' understanding of the Christ. Stay with me here. Today is Palm Sunday in the Christian calendar, so there's a lot of Jesus happening everywhere else. The Christ in the Unitarian conception, right, was lower than God. It was some kind of power. And I think that Richard Rohr, a Catholic theologian from today, has a really good definition of how they understood it. He says that Christ is the name for the transcendent within of everything. All matter, the whole cosmos, when it is anointed with purpose and goodness that is creative, life-giving, and joyous, it is another name for everything in its fullness, in its wholeness. We might say to be our highest self. That's what the Christ is for these folks. So that Channing, in lifting up the moral virtues and the capacity for human choice as divine, was making this path between orthodoxy that he grew up with and heresy, infidelity, what others would charge him with. His 1819 sermon was one of the most widely read pieces of literature across the world over the next few years. It was translated into many languages. It influenced a ton of thinkers, theologians, folks within Christianity and without, both scholars, preachers, and lay folks. The UU Bibliography and Dictionary says, his Christian humanism inspired both religious and literary features of the Transcendentalist movement, amongst others. He was an exemplar of Christian faith, a champion of human rights and dignity. He effectively fostered social reform in areas of free speech, education, peace, relief for the poor, and anti-slavery. His pulpit orations, according to Ralph Waldo Emerson, were a kind of public conscience. Like he was speaking for the conscience of the liberal people of the day. The Transcendentalist, you may have heard of, another big part of our UU history. He was considered an honorary Transcendentalist, right? When he came back from Richmond, he had this experience of seeing God not just in this group of Trinitarian figures, but in everything in the natural world. It was his idea for a group of literary folks to get together and discuss this. These Transcendentalists, like Emerson, Fuller, Alcott, Hedge, and others, who found divinity in the natural world, He was the brain trust of that idea, but he did not attend meetings because he said, I know how much weight my voice carries, and I don't want to be the influencing opinion. This is not just for a matter of church, this is a matter for everyone. Some of our leaders could learn that kind of humility. When he looked out on the natural world, to quote Richard Rohr, he said, creation is the first Bible, and that everything visible without exception must be an outpouring of the divine. Channing would have loved this. This champion of religious liberty, religious inclusion, of heterodoxy, of humanism, and Unitarian Christianity together. When he gave this sermon in 1819, we consider it the beginnings of Unitarianism as we know it today, and of Unitarian Universalism as we know it today. This great spiritual awakening for the people who were there in Baltimore, the people who identified as churchy people, but also for everyone else. When he talks about virtue and morality, he's trying to make it universal. He's not saying you have to sit in a pew on a Sunday to be inspired. He went to the poor folks of the Boston area and to anti-poverty groups wherever he traveled to make it a part of his ministry. He was said to inspire folks with the vision for their potential as individuals, regardless of their religious understandings. Told them politics, education, art, literature could all be means of development and prosperity. That working on yourself, trying to become your highest self, is part of the practice of likeness to God. Any notion that the majority of human beings with a moral nature were created only to serve the wealthy, to elevate the few, was a violation of human rights. He was working for the people. And in working for the people, he always came back to the connection between the people and the divine. That humanity was right alongside divinity because of our human mind, our ability to change, our ability to grow. He reminded people that religion, the word we have is religion, religio, is related to the idea of ligaments in your body that connect everything. To re-ligament, to reconnect, to restore, and to remember. To remember not that you are inherently depraved and worthless, as he grew up hearing, but to remember that you're inherently good, and that there's a divinity inside of you, the reason, the morality, the purpose that Christ, the transcendent within, the living into your fullness, your wholeness, your healthness. I think he was offering that our job as humans is to remember, to reconnect, and then to grow and live out these highest ideals, to be our highest selves. So for Channing, that included working with the poor folks in society, to work for the folks that capitalism said are not endowed with that transcendent within, the impoverished and the enslaved. As I've said, he helped found anti-poverty groups wherever he went. He had social reform and an offering for the poor taken up at his ordination service. And he was a supporter of the abolition movement early on. Remember his granddaddy, signer of the Declaration of Independence, who awakened those notions of life and liberty within him from an early age. He was all these things. And he was a Unitarian. He was not Theodore Parker, who was a Universalist minister, who was an ardent abolitionist, spoke out about it whenever he could, and preached on Sunday with a gun in his pulpit in case someone came through the doors to try and take back the human beings that were in his pews. That was not Channing. He was a little more subdued. He was not fiery. But for many Americans, that was actually more appealing. His reason, his morality arguments, his respectability, people said. His support of the abolition and anti-slavery movement was not fiery. It was not out in the streets leading the protest, but it was needed to get a lot of folks on board. In days when abolitionists were labeled treasonous, the John Browns of the world were murdered. The respectability with the white folks of the time, I think that's what helped make the movement possible. So we recognize the seeds of much of our modern UU thought in Channing and in his Baltimore sermon. See if these sound familiar. Reason and morality, liberal politics, anti-racism work, freedom of belief, earth-based reverence, highest selves, very long sermons, a European Christian lens to view the world through, and sometimes more talk than action. We see a lot of ourselves. And I think of his awakening over time, of his conversion experiences, his encounters with people and connecting them to the divinity, of the understanding of the power of his voice and how he could use it to affect change, how he spoke from his heart, his head, and his values, and that he didn't try to be something he wasn't. Theologian G.K. Chesterton said, "Your religion is not the church you belong to, but the cosmos you live inside of." It's not about the beliefs you profess. It's about the world you're connected to and how you live inside of it, how you live out your values in the world, the transcendent within of everything that we are called to awaken to remember, to re-ligament, to reconnect. For Channing, that took the language of Christian humanism, using his voice to make moral arguments, speaking to the people, helping the poor. Those were his gifts. Always working to take those on the outer edge and bring them into the center, to widen the circle, restoration and reconciliation. But he also stayed in his lane. He didn't try to be someone he wasn't. He didn't protest in the streets, but used his gifts the best way that he could to be his highest self. I take a lot of heart in that. In times when we are called to be many things, those of us who are leaders, those of us who are part of communities, we can feel stretched in many directions. My hope for us is that we may remember our inherent goodness, connect with our transcendent within, awaken to the gifts, the fullness, our highest selves, and be those people. And if we are those people as individuals, then maybe we might make a community of highest selves that is in itself a highest self. And friends, that is the definition of the beloved community. Not the religion that we belong to, not the church that we belong to, but the cosmos we live inside of. May it be one of original goodness. May we awaken to what love has to teach us. And may this week, this spring, this year be the beginning of that hope. Blessed be. May it be so. Amen.